The storm wasn't the worst thing that happened that night. That honor went to the fight. Hours ago, I was home, screaming at him, at Brandon, for reasons that felt life or death in the moment, but blurred into something petty after I slammed the door. "You never listen. It's like talking to a damn wall," I'd shouted, throwing my coat on, his face a perfect picture of indifference. The look that kills me every time. I'd told myself I didn't care if he followed me or not, but when the car headlights pierced through the snow and no one stood in the doorway, something inside me cracked. I drove without direction, pushing through the blizzard like the chaos outside could somehow drown out the chaos in my head. That's how I ended up here, stranded in a gas station in the middle of nowhere, my car parked outside, half covered in snow. I'd filled up the tank but hadn't even gotten the chance to pay. The storm slammed harder as if the universe was punishing me for leaving. So, the store was pretty much empty, except for this guy Wyatt. At least that's what his name tag said. He looked like he was in his late teens, probably 19. He was behind the counter and didn't even bother to look up when I walked in. I grabbed some chips and a soda, just out of habit, you know. Anything to make me feel less bored. I was about to head to the checkout when the door swung open. The cold came first, biting and sharp, crawling across the back of my neck. Then him. He walked in like the storm had let him go just for this, snow falling from his shoulders as he shook it off. His face was the kind you'd expect on a magazine cover. Sharp lines, piercing eyes, the kind of confidence that wasn't learned but inherited. He was younger, sure, but there was something about him that made me feel out of place, like I was the one intruding. I pretended not to notice, keeping my head down, my hands tight around a can of soda. But he didn't look away. His gaze was like a weight, pressing into me without a single word. And then the lights went out. The fluorescent hum cut off mid-buzz, leaving us in near darkness. Outside, the storm roared, shaking the glass panes. The only light came from the snow, pale and eerie, casting jagged shadows through the windows. "Wyatt?" My voice cracked as I called out to the clerk. Nothing. He was gone, disappeared into the back, and I was left with the stranger. I knew he was still there. I could feel him, the same way you feel thunder before it strikes. The air shifted, electric and heavy. I gripped the counter, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Somewhere out there, my husband was still at home, furious, and I was here, trapped with a man who felt like both a threat and a salvation. I wasn't the kind of woman who believed in omens, but as the storm screamed against the glass and the stranger's shadow moved in the dim light, I realized something. Fate didn't wait for you to believe in it. It came for you anyway. The power hadn't come back on, and the snow had only gotten worse. Outside, the storm raged like an unstoppable beast, and the world beyond the gas station was swallowed up by the thick veil of white. We were stuck, all three of us, and it was clear we wouldn't be going anywhere until morning. The uneasy tension in the air hung between us as we stood there in the darkened store. I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, the faint rustle of paper as Wyatt returned from the back. He'd obviously given up on trying to fix the lights, and I could hear him muttering under his breath as he grabbed a pack of gum and an old lantern, presumably for emergencies, and plopped back onto the counter. "Guess we're stuck here for a while," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. It felt odd, almost unnatural to break the quiet.
"Looks like it,"
Wyatt mumbled, barely looking up from his phone. It was as if he didn't care in the slightest about the storm or being trapped in a tiny store with strangers. The moment his eyes were back on his screen, I realized I didn't need to worry about him. He wasn't much for conversation, and I wasn't about to force one. I turned my attention to the man who had come in from the back. Dave. I'd overheard Wyatt call him earlier. There was something magnetic about him, despite the plainness of his clothes. Dark jeans and a woolen jacket that seemed to have absorbed the cold from the storm outside. He had a presence that couldn't be ignored. His eyes were an amber brown, warm and easy, and there was a kindness in his smile that drew me in. though he hadn't said much. "Well, it's a bit of a strange way to spend the night," I said, smiling a little as I tried to make the best of the situation. He chuckled, his voice deep and soothing, like the sound of something soft but strong.
Yeah, a bit. I've never been stuck in a gas station before, but I guess there's worse places to be.
I liked the way he said that, like he was acknowledging the weirdness of the situation, but also accepting it with ease. It was refreshing. "What do you suggest we do to pass the time?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation into something less awkward. He took a step closer, and in the dim light, his smile took on a knowing look, something that sent a shiver down my spine, but not entirely in fear.
"How about a game?"
he suggested, his voice low and velvety. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A game? What kind of game?" He reached behind the counter, his fingers brushing against a dusty bottle of soda. He spun it in his hands, the glass catching the light.
"Spin the bottle,"
he said, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt a flush creep up my cheeks, and I glanced over at Wyatt, who was finally looking up from his phone, his eyes wide with surprise.
"Spin the bottle? Isn't that a bit juvenile?"
he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dave's smile deepened, and he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
"Not the way I play it. Whoever the bottle lands on has to dance."
The room fell silent, the air thick with a mix of shock and curiosity. Wyatt's mouth hung open slightly, and I could feel my own heartbeat quickening. "Dance?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely audible. Dave nodded, his eyes gleaming with a dark intensity.
"Yes, dance like no one is watching?"
I gulped. The idea was so absurd, so weird in a situation like this, but there was something undeniably thrilling about it. The thought of doing that in front of these strangers sent a wave of heat coursing through me. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably on the counter, his eyes darting between Dave and me.
"I don't know, man. That's kind of weird,"
he mumbled. Dave shrugged, a casual gesture that belied the tension in the room.
"It's just a suggestion, something to pass the time, but if you're both too chicken..."
He let the words hang in the air, a challenge that was impossible to ignore. I took a deep breath, my mind made up. I wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and there was something about Dave, something about the way he looked at me, that made me want to push the boundaries, to explore the edges of this strange, charged atmosphere. "All right," I said, my voice steady and sure. "Let's play." Dave placed the bottle on the floor, giving it a spin. We all watched as it twirled. It slowed, the neck pointing at Wyatt. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement.
"Me? No way I'm doing that,"
he said, his voice squeaking slightly. Dave nodded, a wicked gleam in his eyes.
"You dance for us, Wyatt."
Wyatt hesitated for a moment, then slowly slid off the counter, his movements uncertain. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from Dave to me, as if seeking some sort of guidance.
"Go on,"
Dave urged, his voice low and encouraging.
"Let yourself go. Feel the music."
There was no music, only the distant howl of the wind outside. But Wyatt began to move. His arms started to flail, a little like a bird trying to take flight in a cage that's too small. The movements grew more erratic, less bird-like and more fish-like. It was the weirdest dance I'd ever seen. Dave and I couldn't help but watch. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. Dave spun the bottle again, and this time it pointed straight at him. He grinned, leaning back against the counter.
"Looks like it's my turn,"
he said, his voice still low and thrumming with energy. He started off with the moonwalk, sliding backward with surprising grace across the cold linoleum floor. His feet glided effortlessly, leaving me in awe. He moved like he'd been born for this, like he'd been dancing in the dark all his life. I watched him, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something about his confidence, the way he owned the space around him, that made me want to be closer to him, to feel that heat that was emanating from his body. After a moment he stopped and spun the bottle once more. This time it came to rest, pointing at me. I could feel the heat of Dave's gaze on me, his eyes never leaving my face as he waited to see what I would do. My thoughts drifted back to a time when things were simpler, when Brandon and I were young, and he would look at me with a kind of hunger in his eyes. We used to play games just like this. It wasn't like it was now. The distance between us so thick it could suffocate. I remembered the way he used to touch me, with tenderness and patience, but now it was as if the spark had long since burned out. Maybe I was allowing myself to be so caught up in this moment. What I was doing felt like a secret revenge against the man I once loved. It was a way to remind myself that I still mattered, that I could still be the woman I once was, the one Brandon had left behind. I took a deep breath and stepped into the circle of light from the lantern, feeling suddenly exposed and vulnerable. But I'd made a promise, and I was going to keep it. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the storm guide my movements. Slowly, I began to sway, back rolling in a way that I'd never allowed myself to do in public before. I let my hands wander, feeling the fabric of my shirt cling to me as I moved. With each step, I peeled away layers of doubt and fear, unveiling more of myself to them. I danced for them, and for myself, letting the storm outside match the tempest building inside me. My dance grew bolder, a testament to how much I was enjoying this strange, impromptu performance. I turned away from them, bent forward, and then, as if the moment couldn't get any more intense, I turned back around and moved in a way that made their jaw dropped. The storm outside had nothing on the heat building in that little convenience store. As my body swayed to the rhythm, I caught myself enjoying it. There was something so liberating about the way their eyes followed me. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But even as I moved sensually, my mind couldn't stop drifting back to Brandon. How would he feel if he knew? If he saw me now, dancing, lost in the moment, giving myself to them in a way I'd never given myself to him? Would he even care? That thought, a sudden sting of bitterness, flashed through me. I felt a wicked thrill in knowing he'd never understand, never see me the way they did. And just like that, guilt and revenge intertwined in my veins, making the fire inside burn hotter. Finally, I stopped. I found both Dave and Wyatt staring at me, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Dave broke the silence first.
Well, that was...
he said, his voice a little gruff. Surprising, I finished for him, my cheeks still flushed from the exertion. I've never done anything like that before. Wyatt just nodded, his eyes wide.
You've got moves,
he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. I shifted uncomfortably as Wyatt's eyes locked with mine. There was a thrill in the air, but beneath that, the guilt churned in my stomach. I knew it wasn't right. This wasn't the way I'd imagined it. This wasn't what I'd expected when I'd walked down the aisle to Brandon all those years ago. But things had changed. Brandon didn't look at me the way they did, like I was something to be desired. And maybe, just maybe, this was my way of reclaiming what I had lost. The pleasure, the desire. I wasn't just a wife anymore. No, tonight, I was someone else. Someone more than what he saw. But guilt, like a heavy cloak, was never far from my mind. I smiled, letting a wave of newfound confidence wash over me. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me," I said, my voice light but deliberate. I didn't explain further, but the glance I gave them carried a weight that made their curiosity tangible. As I walked away, I could feel their eyes following me, intrigued and expectant. My heart raced, not from nerves, but from exhilaration. In the quiet solitude of the bathroom stall, I closed the door softly and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. This is happening, I thought, the words echoing in my mind like a mantra. This was the kind of moment I'd only dared to dream about. Two young, vibrant men caught in the allure of my presence, captivated by me. For so long, I'd thought those fantasies were just that, impossible daydreams for a woman in her 60s, whose chances of rekindling passion felt as distant as the stars. But here I was, standing at the edge of a reality I never thought I'd taste. I allowed myself to savor it in the quiet of the stall, closing my eyes to replay the way they had looked at me. Not just with admiration, but with hunger, the kind of hunger that had been absent from my life for far too long. My reflection in the mirror confirmed what I already knew. No, I wasn't in my prime, but I carried something more enduring, a poise, a grace that years of experience had etched into every movement I made. At the sink, I freshened up, my fingers trembling slightly as I adjusted my makeup and smoothed my hair. Each action was deliberate, like a ritual of preparation. When I stepped back into the room, the air felt different, thicker, charged. Wyatt's gaze was steady, smoldering, while Dave's lips curved into a grin that sent a spark of heat through me.
Wow, you look stunning.
Dave murmured, his voice soft but drenched in admiration. Wyatt let out a low whistle, his tone playful but undeniably sincere.
Damn, you're not just turning heads, you're stealing hearts.
I laughed softly, the sound warm and inviting. Thank you, gentlemen. You're too kind. The atmosphere was intense now, an unspoken understanding weaving itself between the three of us. Dave stepped closer, his presence reassuring but charged.
We'll follow your lead,
he said, his voice low, almost intimate. Wyatt mirrored his movement, his touch light as his hand brushed mine, sending a shiver through me. His boyish smile carried an edge of nervous excitement, and I found it endearing, grounding even. It's okay, I said softly, my own voice steady despite the wild flutter of my heart. Let's just see where this goes. And with that, the invisible barriers began to dissolve. It started slowly, with small gestures, deliberate, unhurried. They gave me space to adjust, to sink into the moment. And as I did, I felt a wave of acceptance wash over me. The argument with Brandon was still fresh in my mind, the words he'd spat at me like daggers.
You're too old,
he'd said, his voice cold and cutting.
I can't even look at you anymore.
Those words stung, but they also lit a spark I hadn't felt in years. It was as if, in that moment, I had been made to feel worthless, invisible. And now, here I was, being looked at with hunger, with desire. Maybe this was my revenge, my chance to show Brandon that I was still capable of being wanted, that I was still desirable. Maybe it wasn't even about the men in the room with me. Maybe it was about him and the power he had taken from me. This was how I would take it back. Dave leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper.
You good?
I nodded, a smile tugging at my lips. More than good. Wyatt's hand settled on the small of my back, and the warmth of his touch spread through me like fire. There was something raw and real in their expressions, eager yet cautious, as if they were just as overwhelmed by the gravity of this moment as I was. Relax, I murmured, my tone both encouraging and commanding. Just let it happen. And they did. Time ceased to matter as the boundaries between us faded. Every touch, every glance, felt like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized was missing. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing, I was living, breathing, feeling. When the night finally gave way to stillness, the place was bathed in a warm, contented silence. I sank into it, my heartbeat slowing as a strange, serene peace settled over me. For the first time in forever, I felt seen, desired, alive. And as I glanced at the two men beside me, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a reminder, a rediscovery of a power I thought I'd lost. I was no longer that woman Brandon had ignored. Tonight, I was the woman they craved, and it was everything I had ever needed.